Hey guys, I want to make you aware of a brief disclaimer before we start this series on mental health in the church that the opinions and the views expressed in these episodes are merely the opinions of those of myself and our guests, and they do not necessarily collaborate with the opinions and views of Hope City Church, Edmonton. So thanks so much for keeping that in mind as you watch these episodes. Take care. Hey guys, welcome back to the Hope City podcast. I'm your host for this series, Justin, and we are continuing our series on mental health in the church. And today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to a doctor in childhood psychology, Dr. Ryan Ton. Ryan, welcome to the show. It's so awesome to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was born and raised in Edmonton. I've been married for 22 years. I have 4 kids, and I've been attending Hope City for just over 20 years.
Now, in our conversation on the phone, just getting to know you a bit better, I was surprised to find out that you actually have your own mental health struggles, as well as being somebody who helps people with those struggles. So
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about what do you struggle with?
Well, just like 50% of Canadians who reach the age of 40-ish, I too struggled with my issues. And actually 14 years ago, it was probably 15 years ago now, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, and we typically know that as OCD. And then I've also been diagnosed with ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So those are 2 areas that I've had to deal with. There have been times where it's been more challenging than others. It kind of comes and goes, but right now the OCD would be considered in remission.
It's just so interesting to have, hear it from a doctor's point of view that they have their own struggles that they need to deal with and manage.
Absolutely, and if they don't have their own struggles, they're not telling you the truth, because we all do. It's just I guess the difference is some people are a little more open to talking about it, and some people, they have more of a professional front.
Yeah.
And and then there's of course times to disclose that information and times not to.
Right.
But yeah, I talk pretty openly about my OCD and ADHD, and it's the people that know me, they know my quirks, and they I don't have a problem with it at all.
So for those of us watching who don't know anything about OCD, could you break it down from kind of a medical perspective, what that is and what it looks like and what the characteristics are?
Yeah, absolutely. So we hear a lot of people, they often say in passing, oh, I have OCD, or I'm so OCD, where it's clinical OCD. That's really, you're dealing with obsessions and compulsions, and that they're recurrent and persistent, and they're very difficult to get rid of. So what typically will happen is there'll be a thought that pops into that person's head, and that person will try to do an action to suppress that thought or to neutralize that thought. So for example, one of the most common things is germs, right? So people with OCD, a lot of times they're afraid of germs. So they'll touch something, they'll have that intrusive thought, and then in order to neutralize that thought, they'll wash their hands compulsively. So it's that those obsessive thoughts, and then the compulsive behaviors to neutralize that. Those are that's kind of the core of what OCD is. And the other thing is that it has to cause significant impairment in your life. Mm-hmm. So most people who are clinically diagnosed with OCD, it'll get to a point where it's so bad that they can't leave their house, or it's interfering with their job or their relationships. And it's no matter how hard you try to get rid of those thoughts and those compulsions, you just can't do it. Right. And that would be kind of the difference between someone saying, "Oh, I'm OCD," like where we're a little bit organized, but yeah. So that's basically what it would look like.
So what are some of the options for treating somebody with OCD, like somebody that comes into your clinic or your office?
So I don't see a whole lot of OCD in kids, at least in my setting that I work in. I certainly see it, but it's not something that I deal with on a daily basis. This is just more from my own experience, having gone through it.
Yeah.
But the 2 main treatments would be psychotherapy. So there's something called cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really effective at dealing with that. And then there's something called exposure and response prevention. And so it's just basically exposure therapy. So, for example, if you're afraid of touching doorknobs because you're afraid of getting germs, you would go and you would slowly learn how to touch doorknobs.
Yeah.
And it's just through that exposure. And then the second way of dealing with it is through medication. And there's lots of different medications that have been approved to treat OCD. They typically fall under the antidepressants, but they also work to help with the compulsive behaviors. And then the combination of the two is kind of like often what seems to bring it into remission.
Do you think that OCD is reversible if people have like, self-discipline and those kind of measures in their lives where they kind of face it?
I wouldn't say it's reversible, but you can definitely put it into it. You can definitely have it go into remission, and you can have the strongest person, the strongest will, the best person, and they're still not going to get it under control if they don't go and get the help that they need.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things, and so. Yeah, you can have the most discipline, you can be the smartest person and know all about it, but you're not going to beat that unless you are getting help for it. And a lot of times we can't bring it into remission, but it's controllable. So it's not ruining your life. And one of the things that people with OCD will often say is that it's ruining my life. I can't leave the house. I can't function normally.
So Ryan, you mentioned that you deal a lot with parents and children in your practice. So what is it like for a parent to have a child that deals with mental health issues?
So yeah, for a lot of parents, it's difficult. A lot of times, we have parents who are in denial that don't want to do anything about it, or they're scared of some of the treatments out there. A lot of parents are just relieved that they know what's going on. And for some parents, they blame themselves and they say, oh, I gave my kid this mental illness, or they learned it from me. But in fact, it's often genetic. So I see a whole lot of different responses. It can be challenging, of course, and it's sometimes really difficult for parents to see their kids struggling and suffering. So I see the whole gamut of responses, and part of my job is just to walk parents through that and just tell them, it's okay. We can treat this. We can make it better. And so yeah, a lot of it is just walking with them, and for me sometimes just to be a bit transparent and talk about my own struggles or the struggles that my kids might have, and just to make it so they know that they're not the only ones going through that.
Yeah. It's so interesting how I find you can feel like you're the only person in the world, or the only parent in the world. It's like, my kid's the only one that has this struggle and stuff. But when you're able to break it down for them and share part of your story, there's that vulnerability that comes in. And you're like, oh, well, I'm not like the only one, or my kid's not the only one, right? So it's just so important to be open about it.
Absolutely. And I find with what I do, if I disclose something that I went through, that my family went through, often those barriers just break down, and the person is much more receptive to getting help or accepting help.
I think it's so important to hear that viewpoint, because I think a lot of the time parents maybe feel overwhelmed, and they might have that fear of the stigma, talking to other family friends and like, oh, my kid has ADHD or my kid has OCD, and they don't want to pin that child with that label. So how can you kind of soften the blow? How do you communicate with a child like, you have this, but it doesn't define who you are? Yeah,
and we don't, like in our family, like we don't talk about it. Like it's not like front and center. As they get older, you can discuss it a little bit more, but only if it's bothering the child. Like sometimes if you have and I'm not talking just about my kids, I'm talking about kids in general. If a child comes and says, why can't I pay attention? Why am I so distracted? Then you can start talking to them about ADHD. But I would never go, oh, you have ADHD, or you have anxiety, and so you're this way and that. I don't know if I would do it that way, but in terms of the stigma, a lot of it is just being open with parents and allowing them to be open about it too.
Yeah.
Because once you start talking about it, it really diffuses the mystique or the stigma or the negativity that surrounds those labels. And I just, in my approach with parents is, try to make it. I mean, it is a big deal, but I try to make it not a big deal. It's just like, it's just like having, like I said, just like having a cold, or it's like having diabetes, or it's like you just deal with it, and it's a process. A lot of parents, especially, a lot of parents, they want their child to be perfect, and who doesn't? But the reality is, like, that's just not it. Like, that's not the case.
Maybe you've had times or low seasons in your own life dealing with OCD and ADHD that you found. Where did God come into the mix when you had those struggles and maybe just those questions?
When I was at my lowest point, so that would have been like 15 years ago, where I was really struggling with OCD. There are times where you kind of feel abandoned, but that's normal to feel that way. But at the same time, it's also a time to get close to God, because I find when there's difficult times, at least in my life, when I'm going through something personally difficult, that's a time for me to reset and to just refocus my thoughts, my prayer life, my devotions on God. And it's just, I've just found in my life, like, sometimes those bad times, those down times, they can end up being good times in the long run, because for me, it's my reset. And it just helps me to focus in, because, sometimes when you're at your lowest, like, all you've got is God. And, and you just cry out to God, and you just need the help. And so it's, in hindsight, looking back at some of those really dark times, it's like, yeah, okay, I get it. Like, God probably just wanted me to reset.
Yeah, for sure.
So
there's that verse in the Bible, Ryan, that talks about, like, taking captive your thoughts and submitting them to Christ. So do you think it's harder for people who struggle with a mental illness to take captive their thoughts and to be obedient and to submit them to Jesus?
Yeah, I think when you're going through it, when you're in the thick of it, and you have, like, severe anxiety, or you're depressed or whatever, and you're supposed to hand it over to Jesus. It does. I think for someone who is going through difficult times, or like a real struggle, it does become more difficult for them, and it becomes, for some people it's defeating, and I've seen it. But what I always try to tell people is, part of that is doing your part too, going for the help, getting the medication, so that you can do that, so that you can hand things over. And I think I find in the Christian world, there's sometimes, and not with everybody, but I've come across people who are really resistant to going and actually doing something about it, because they're like, I'm just going to hand it over to Jesus.
Right.
Well, yes, you're supposed to, but whenever Jesus healed somebody in the Bible, often there was a condition to it, like, go dip in the pool 7 times, go wash the mud off of your eyes, go do this. And it's like it's a step of faith. And I think for mental health, it's the same thing. You got to do something. Like, God has provided us with the tools to deal with a lot of these things. He's given people expertise in how to help you overcome those things. And we have the medications to help, deal with those things. So in my mind, a lot of it is just being obedient and, taking that step of faith, going and do something about it, and handing it over to God at the same time. And to me, it's just, it goes hand in hand.
Yeah, it's so important to lay down that pride and that self-interest that we can so easily fall into and be like, oh, I can do this on my own strength and stuff. But the very act of giving that to God, that responsibility over to Him, is that we need to be responsible and to seek wisdom of, like, people around us, like doctors and friends and family, and be like, I need help, and what are the tools in place now that I can use to better myself so that I can hand it over. So I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think there's that stigma in Christians where they have that pride where they're not really willing to get help because they think Jesus is just going to take it from them, right?
Yeah.
That may be the case sometimes, but it may not always be the case.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. I've seen people, where they've prayed and there's been miraculous intervention and they haven't had to, do those things. But more often than not, there are steps that you actually have to take too, in sync with handing things over to God. So it's, and I think it's interesting. I think in Canadian, in Canada and North America, there's something that I call, like, the Sunday morning culture. And that's like you roll into church in your nice car, you've got your trophy wife, your 2 perfect kids, and you roll into church and everybody thinks you're perfect. Everything is fine. And it's almost, I'm not saying Hope City's like that, but you know what I'm talking about, right? Like
it's the culture.
It's the culture, you put your best face forward, and there is a pride with that. And, admitting that you have a mental illness or whatever is sometimes hard for people. And I think part of the reason why, sometimes God allows us to go through that is just to break down that pride and to just be real. Mm-hmm. So...
Yeah, it's interesting. Like Paul talked a lot about having a thorn, and we don't really know for sure what that thorn was, but it could have been mental illness, it could have been his eyesight, it could have been a number of things. But I think it's so interesting. We can be doing well in our Christian walk, but then, a mental health struggle comes up. Like for myself, bipolar came up 10 years ago. And I was like, I thought life was going really well. And then I graduated high school and things were going good. And then I had this struggle and I was in the hospital after a few weeks. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I feel like my life's falling apart. But it's just it's so humbling to be able to be like, God, I don't have it all together and I need help and I need the support of the people around me to do better and to become, well again.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. And I think I really do believe that there are times where, God allows us to walk through those trials so that we will rely on him more. Because, if everything's going right all the time, why do we need God?
Exactly. And it's so important to have that heaven-sent perspective where, we can rejoice in every circumstance, in the circumstances that are challenging, in the circumstances we don't want to deal with, the seasons we don't want to live through, we can still be like, God, you're still good and faithful, even though I'm struggling with OCD, I'm struggling with bipolar, I know that you're still good. And this isn't like, you're not doing this to me, maybe you're doing this for me.
Yeah, exactly. And often it just takes... a little bit of hindsight. So sometimes several months or several years afterwards, you look back and you go, oh, okay, now I get it. Now I know why.
Yeah.
So
maybe there's somebody watching today, Ryan, that's struggling with that pride and that kind of that need to get help or that need to take action, but they're just kind of stuck. What kind of advice would you give to them, whether it's for themselves or for their child to get help? What would you say to them?
One of the first places you can go is just your family doctor. And they can give you a good idea if what you're dealing with is beyond their expertise, or if it's, so I guess what I'm saying is just go to someone and talk to someone about it, someone who knows a little bit more about what could be going on than you. And that would be the first step. And then, reach out to your church family. A lot of churches, depending where you go, they do have care ministries where you can go and talk to someone. And again, if it's beyond their level of expertise, there's a network of people that they can refer to, but it's the point is talk to someone about it. Don't deal with it alone. If you're struggling with your kids, talk to someone about it. And it doesn't always have to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Mm-hmm. You can just talk to someone who's been going through something similar. But I would say, don't struggle alone. Don't struggle in silence. If you're struggling, get on it, deal with it, and face it head on.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today, Ryan.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You gave a lot of value to myself. I learned a lot, and I know everybody watching learned a lot too. So, thank you guys so much for tuning in this week. We're so excited to be doing this series and talking about the hard conversations about mental health in the church. So if you find that you're struggling with a mental health issue or you have the warning signs that we've talked about in the past 4 episodes, please don't be afraid to reach out and get help. We have some resources in the comments and the links below, and please don't be afraid to write to us, comment. Take care.